Welcome back to Raised by Giants, where we talk all things spirituality. I'm Ryder Lee. Tonight we have returning guest, Oxford scholar, author, and researcher Dr. Joseph Farrell, speaking about JFK, the original Zapruder film, and the militarization of space. But before I introduce him, check out Raised by Giants on Rockfin. It is a completely uncensored platform. Go over there, set up a free account, get all of my regular content I post here on YouTube, and sign up for Rockfin's premium content, which is far less than a YouTube premium account, at only $10 a month. And you'll get all of my premium uncensored content when it gets released, and all of the other creators' premium content as well, like Beyond Classified, Charlie Robinson, Jay Dyer, Zero with Sam Tripoli, Tinfoil Hat, Eddie Bravo, and Rex Bear Leak Project, and much more. Check the link in the description to sign up for the video streaming platform, Rockfin. Also, check out C60 Purple Power. It is the most powerful antioxidant on the planet. Helps with energy levels, skin problems, infections, eyesight, brain cognition, EMF radiation, and a lot more. It's a free radical sponge that gives your body the ability to heal itself. And if you use promo code GIANTS10 from the link in the description, you'll get 10% off your entire purchase. I highly recommend it. I've been using it for over a year with my own money, and I wouldn't recommend something that doesn't work. Hello, Dr. Joseph Farrell. Welcome back to the show. Thanks so much for coming back on. I'm very excited to speak with you again. I'm really excited to have a great conversation with you. So let's just jump into this right here. Well, first off, how are you doing, my friend?
Well, I'm hanging in there. I think all of us are. Thanks for having me back, though, and appreciate it.
No problem. I appreciate you. And so let's just get this off of the rip. Do you think that JFK had any kind of knowledge of advanced craft that we might have been developing? And if he did, did that have anything to do with his assassination?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. In all the years that I've studied that assassination and the whole issue of Black Project's research, other than one document, which is the Torbit document, I've not seen any documentary evidence that he was given any sort of more than normal access to those programs. Um, I do suspect that he, like President Eisenhower, who both of them had reached the conclusion that the military industrial complex was already out of control. And, if that's going on in the late 50s and 60s, imagine what it is today. But I strongly suspect that both men were able, by dint of their personal contacts, to gain some sort of above normal access to what was going on in those projects, although it would have been, by the nature of the case, unauthorized in their case. Uh, Kennedy, of course, as you mentioned before we started the recording, you wanted to talk about Secretary Forrestal. Kennedy was of course a close friend with Secretary of John Forrestal, and Eisenhower certainly knew him and had similar connections within the military. So both men, I suspect, had some sort of knowledge of those things. Now, in Kennedy's case, I mentioned the Torbit document for a reason, because in that document, which, if people don't know what it is, the Torbit document is a kind of a compendium or a summary of the research that came out of Jim Garrison's investigation when he was conducting his investigation of Clay Shaw. The Torbit document is kind of a compendium of all of that stuff that was put together by an attorney in southern Texas. And incidentally, that attorney was a member of Lyndon Johnson's political machine. So, in other words, this guy was connected. But anyway, in the Torbit document, there is a brief reference to something called DISC, the Defense Industrial Security Command. And it spells DISC, obviously. This was allegedly some sort of special security unit that was established to watch those kinds of technologies. And guess who the head of it was? Werner von Braun. So if Kennedy knows anything, I suspect that given his frequent appearances, and you have to go to the photographic record to see this, but when Kennedy goes and visits NASA, he's usually seen in the company of 2, if not 3 people all the time. And that's James Webb, the head of NASA at the time, and then Werner von Braun and Dr. Kurt Davis. And, I've written reams about Dr. Kurt Davis, but Kennedy's usually seen in their company. And to me, that's very suggestive that if there is a private, so to speak, gateway for that information to get to Kennedy, it's those 3 that are going to be providing it to him. So, yeah, I think he's got access, but again, like I say, I've not seen rigid, hard documentary evidence of it. I'm constructing a case on the fly here because your question's so good. I don't think anybody's ever really asked that.
Yeah, it's interesting because the Torbit document, if it wasn't for that document, we wouldn't have a lot of information about JFK and the investigation.
Oh yeah, no, it would be gone. It would be gone.
So how plausible is it that, because this may be a story that's just been constructed by the community, right?
Okay.
But how plausible is it that JFK might have went to Germany with James Forrestal after World War II and looked at the Nazi Bell technology?
Well, it is a matter of fact and record that he did accompany James Forrestal to Germany after the end of the war. What is not known, and I suspect very strongly, is a reconstruction, a guess. What is not known is how many of those installations he actually saw. Now, given the extent of Nazi facilities, I'm quite certain that he probably at least saw some of them. He and Forrestal went to Berlin. Okay. So if you're going to go to Berlin and you're in the company of the acting Secretary of Defense, and you've got basically nothing to look at but piles of rubble, okay, where are you going to go? What are you going to visit? Well, obviously, one of the places is you're going to go see the bunker. And of course, Kennedy writes in his diary that, yeah, he went down into the bunker to see where Dolph supposedly spent his last days as dictator of the ever shrinking Greater Germany. But another place that I can guarantee you that you're probably going to want to go see is the underground communications complex in a little suburb of Berlin called Soesen. There was a huge 3-storied underground communications facility that ran all of the OKW's military communications. In other words, the whole German military is run out of this facility, underground facility, that also is tapped into the trunk lines. Berlin's telephone system at the time was based on trunk lines that ran in a big circle around the city. So in other words, the Germans planned this war beginning in the 1920s. They were building all of this stuff. Well, this facility at Sosin was ultimately in the Russian zone, but at the time of Kennedy's visit, the Russians probably would not have been that careful about who they let go see some of these facilities. In other words, the Cold War hadn't settled yet. So I don't have any difficulty that Kennedy's going to at least be exposed to some of these facilities. Now, with respect to the Bell, I don't know of any documentary evidence that exists that he ever visited the facilities in Upper Silesia, which is where those facilities were located. That would have been some distance from Berlin, and given the state of Germany's infrastructure at the time, would have been rather difficult to reach.
Do you know what
So
year him and Forrestal went to?
45,
45. So
45.
directly after the war, then.
Right, right. It was, if I recall, it was after the formal end of the war in Europe and before the end of the war in the Pacific. So it was in that time frame during the summer. So it's in the aftermath of Potsdam, and it's before basically the Iron Curtain slams down.
Yeah, it's
So,
interesting because almost immediately after that, in 1947, James Forrestal becomes
right,
Secretary of Defense, the very first Secretary of Defense. And this is supposedly when MJ-12 was
right,
born. And the
right,
story goes that Forrestal wanted to, release the technology of the advanced craft that had been created or back engineered from Nazi tech within MJ-12. And this created enemies for Forrestal, and Truman forced Forrestal's resignation. And then they locked him up in a sanitarium and made him out to be crazy at Bethesda Naval
right,
Hospital
right.
in Maryland. And then he died on May 22nd, 1949, by falling out of the 16th story window of the hospital.
And allegedly tying a noose with bed sheets in his bathrobe, and yeah, no, I'm sorry, folks. I'm not buying that one for a minute. There's a strange connection there with Forrestal, because not only is Forrestal linked directly to John Kennedy, he's also linked directly to Senator Joseph McCarthy, who, of course, is close friends with John Kennedy. And McCarthy, goes on to, in my opinion, I don't know if you've read my book about McCarthy and the whole UFO, the UFO angle about him. But a few years ago, when I published Monmouth McCarthy and the Deep State, I finally got a hold of the actual transcripts from his committee during his hearings on the security problems at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. And to my surprise, these transcripts were only declassified in 2003.
Wow.
So in other words, 50 years after Senator McCarthy is, deposed and, basically dies a year later, or 3 years later, we're getting the transcripts of his committee and can actually read what went on rather than be told by, our lamestream propatainment, ever accurate media what went on. So I'm sitting there reading these dang transcripts, and I'm flabbergasted because in the middle of these hearings on possible communist penetration of one of our most sensitive military bases, McCarthy is constantly, he and Roy Cohn both, are constantly dropping references to July 1947. And at some points, McCarthy is even asking some of these radar scientists, and, oh, were you out in New Mexico doing your radar experiments? Oh, say around July 3rd, 1947. I'm thinking, well, Joe, that's quite a little bombshell to drop in closed hearings. And this scientist answers, well, yeah, we were out there doing all sorts of stuff. And oh yes, and what kind of pictures were you guys taking of our atomic can? As this goes on and on. And I'm thinking, why these constant references, coded references to Roswell? And then McCarthy turns around and starts asking him, "Oh, and where did those top secret diaries go?" And this was all part of the Air Force operation. Do you recall the name of that? Was it Blue Book? I'm thinking, this is not the Joe McCarthy that we've been taught about in the history books. And it's right there in the transcripts. And I thought, this is the reason these transcripts were kept classified. This is the reason. Now, when you add that to the fact that McCarthy is a very close friend to the Kennedy family, that for a certain period of time, Bobby Kennedy is the assistant counsel on his committee, that John Kennedy avoided the censure vote in the U.S. Senate by scheduling his back surgery when the vote would take place. There's another pipeline for this UFO information to come to Kennedy, and it would be coming directly from Senator Joe McCarthy. So yeah, I think the Kennedys have such a wide network of people that they can tap into to ask questions about some of this advanced technology, that there's no doubt in my mind that something was passed from McCarthy, from Hoover to McCarthy to Bobby Kennedy to John. that doesn't take much dot connecting to figure that out.
Absolutely, I agree. And speaking of top secret diaries, what do you think of Admiral Byrd? Do you think that is a real, true story, that he went to Antarctica and
Yes,
encountered?
I do think the story of Operation High Jump is true. I do not think the so-called diaries that are floating out there on the internet are true. I think those are gigantic distractions. The only documentary evidence that we have of Admiral Byrd mentioning any sort of advanced technology is that very brief article that appears in El Mercurio de Santiago, the newspaper of Santiago, Chile. And I put a copy of the actual article that Byrd's comments appeared in my book, Reich of the Black Sun.
That's the comments where he made that someday we'll have to
defend ourselves against and here are his words: against enemy fighters that can fly from pole to pole with tremendous speed. He does not say extraterrestrial, he does not say alien, he says enemy. And in the context of the Cold War and World War II just ending, what does that mean? Well, we don't know. Then Admiral Byrd, and this is very important for people to understand, there's something very fishy about Admiral Byrd, but folks, please throw out all of that nonsense out there about secret Nazi UFO research bases in Antarctica. This is a bunch of claptrap. Yep. After Byrd gets back to the United States, he appears on a kind of a Sunday morning Meet the Press show, the old Longines watch show. And you can go on YouTube and find this interview with Admiral Byrd. And he appears on this show. He gives a nice hour-long, question answering thing. He then writes a special article for the National Geographic magazine all about his expedition. And this comes out in a complete magazine, which I think is his attempt to cover up whatever it was he was doing down there. But basically, the article in National Geographic is about the expedition, the equipment they used, the soldiers that they lost during the expedition, unfortunately, and on it goes. So it's a nice article and fairly detailed. So fast forward the clock to it's either his son or his nephew. I forget. I always forget which it is, but On the anniversary of Admiral Byrd having written that article for National Geographic, his son or his nephew are invited to Washington, D.C. to give a special talk about it. And they disappear on the way, on the train. They end up dead in Baltimore, Maryland, discovered in an abandoned warehouse. The case is still open. They don't know why or who, but they suspect homicide. And in the meantime, as before all of this takes place, who becomes the owner of the Texas School Book Depository? Why, a man by the name of Colonel Byrd, who happens who happens to be Admiral Byrd's relative, close relative, uncle
Was it
or
was it his
brother,
cousin or
cousin or
brother?
something
Yeah.
like, yeah, ends up being a close relative to Admiral Byrd and owning the Texas School Depository. Now, folks, come on. You can argue that this is all coincidence, of course, but you're pressing the actuarial tables rather severely if you do. So yeah, I think there's something else going on here too. And given that strange connection, did John Kennedy find out something else too about Antarctica and the bird expert? Who knows? But he was clearly a threat. And by golly, we better get him to Dallas and have him right there at that particular place so we can kill him because because if he continues on this course, everything's gonna come undone. And here we are. We're stuck with Biden Joe and his magical reappearing documents. So this is what happens when you let a coup d'etat run your country, folks.
Another interesting thing that is Lloyd Breckner.
Oh
Lloyd
yeah,
Breckner was the inventor of the shortwave radio systems and was instrumental in forming NASA and later on data collection for the World Wide Web and
right.
take trips around the world to set up radio stations. And most notable was going with Admiral Byrd to Antarctica to set up radio stations, which is another hardcore connection here between NASA,
Right.
JFK, and Admiral Byrd.
And the Germans, because let's remember what the Germans probably did in Antarctica was they probably set up one of their automated weather stations at the minimum. And they may have, had very small teams running some of these radio stations down there too. So, I don't put anything past these people. There's another thing that most people forget that may have played some role in Kennedy's demise, and that is that during the late 1950s, just as NASA is being set up by Eisenhower and then morphs into the space agency, most people forget that during the late 50s, very early 60s, NASA conducted or sponsored a top secret optical telescopic study of the surface of the moon. In other words, they were using telescopes to take photographs and all sorts of stuff of the moon. And as far as I know, no one has ever pried that study out of the archives of the federal government. I rather strongly suspect that Eisenhower and Kennedy were also able to access at least some of what those photographic studies may have turned up. And if that's the case, it puts a new spin on Kennedy's offer to share what they knew and go to the moon with the Soviets. Once you make that offer to Nikita Khrushchev, you're going to be sharing any study like that you have. Here's a few tidbits of what we photographed. What did you guys photograph? That sort of thing. So that's another avenue that people have forgotten about that I think needs to be looked into, at least with Eisenhower and Kennedy.
Yeah, it may be possible that JFK instead of making a push to reveal the technology internally, because he kind of saw what happened to his friend Forrestal. He decided
Right.
to do it out in the open, but
Right.
covertly out in the open by saying we're going to the moon in May of 1961, announcing it before the special joint session of Congress
Right.
that the aim should be to get man to the moon before the decade's end. And again, if you remember at Rice Stadium in September of '62, and it's really shaping up like this was the plan to try and force their hand to reveal the tech, right? Because he knew we had it, and that was possibly the only way that we could actually get to the moon. Standard rocketry would be very difficult, right? And no rocket had ever went outside of low Earth orbit because I personally believe that it can't. Right, not a single one of NASA's test flights, Mercury, Gemini, and 61, 62, 63, ever went outside of low Earth orbit, right? And they weren't even NASA test flights then; they were Air Force test flights. And so the amount of gas, right, that it would take to get to the moon in a standard rocket would be astronomical, right? This is why I believe Werner von Braun stated it would take a rocket the size of the Empire State Building to get to the moon, because the rocket would have to be that big in order to store all the gas to make it
Well,
there.
it depends. It depends on the amount of load that you want to get there. If you're looking at a crew of 6 to 10, a rocket the size of the and carrying a bunch of stuff with you, yeah, a rocket the size of the Empire State Building would do it. I'm not. I'll be honest with you. I'm just not in the crowd that believes that these things are not possible with rockets. What I am in the crowd is the inability of chemical rockets to go out and mine asteroids or to sustain a minimal human permanent presence on another celestial body like the moon or like Mars, not to mention the engineering difficulty of constructing viable shelters for a human presence, particularly on a body like the moon. But I'm not in the Apollo hoaxer category. What I've always insisted upon, however, is that there are features of the Apollo mission that are weird, not the least of which is having a Nazi in charge of it. Not the least of which is supposedly landing on the moon on the 25th anniversary of the assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler in 1944. Whose ego is really landing here? And the real big problem that I've always had, and I think I've talked with you before about this, when I was a boy, I would watch the moon shots all the time. And I think it was Apollo 14 or 15, after they got the cameras on the legs of the lunar excursion module and were, televising the liftoffs from the moon. Well, I remember the first one of these when the lunar excursion module lifts off from the moon. Well, it just sort of pops up and goes away.
Yeah, it does.
Just, and I'm looking at this. I don't remember how old I was, 12 or 13 years old. And I'm watching this laying on the floor of our living room. My dad's sitting in the armchair behind me, smoking his cigarettes and reading the paper. And I'm looking at that, and I turn around and I look at my dad, and I say, "Rockets don't do that." And he grunts something. I don't remember what what he grunted, but he was an engineer, and yeah, you're right. And what bothered me about it, and I say this in all sincerity. This is what bothers me about the Apollo hoaxer people, because they can't see what their eyes are telling them. If Stanley Kubrick is hoaxing all of this on a studio in California, as some of them argue, he could have done a hell of a lot better job of hoaxing a rocket liftoff from anywhere other than just to have it pop up and go away. you know.
Is there
And
shots of the
oh yeah,
Apollo lunar lander, Apollo 11 lunar lander taken up off of the moon?
yeah, yeah. And here's the problem with it: rockets accelerate geometrically. In other words, per unit of time, they're going to go a little bit further per unit of time after the launch. But what you see is more or less a pop up and a constant rate of acceleration rather than an increasing one. Follow me? It
Mm-hmm.
just pops up. So either that to me is a very bad hoax, a really, really, really bad hoax, or there's another kind of technology really at work. That's what I suspect
I
is going
suspect
on.
I suspect that too, that it was more of a highly advanced technology that
Right,
got us there and got us back off of the moon.
right,
But
right.
I haven't seen the Apollo 11 lunar
Well,
module.
the Apollo 11, no, it's not Apollo 11 that occurs with. You
It's a
see,
different
you see,
mission.
it's a later mission where you
Yeah.
see the television cameras that are on the leg. They actually have the liftoff. But the problem with the hoax theory is that Stanley Kubrick is not a stupid man. If he's gonna hoax a film of a rocket lifting off from the moon, he's gonna do it the right way. But instead, we get this this ridiculous pop up. And the other problem is the Apollo hoaxers are correct in that some aspects of the feed had to have been done on a studio, because I have the Australian footage that shows the Coke bottle that Australians saw in their version of the Apollo landing rolling across the bottom of the screen. So, you know, we're dealing folks we're dealing with the United States government here. This is one of the most corrupt, lying governments in history. So yeah, you have to parse everything they tell us and argue your case. That's my case. We used a rocket to get there, but there was an alternative technology involved that also got helped to get us there, and much more importantly helped to get us off of there once we got stuck there. So that's my take.
My only issue and my only problem with us getting there in a rocket, Joseph, is wouldn't you want to do some test runs outside of Earth's orbit before you do? I mean, we have
well
zero documentation of test flights by NASA or the Air Force breaking
well
outside
they
of Earth's
did
orbit.
do that. That's what Mercury and Gemini and all that stuff were really about, because if you go back and look at Project Mercury, Project Gemini, particularly Gemini, with the spacewalks, with the docking procedures and all of that stuff that they were doing, this was all preparation. And prior to that, the biggest problem that I have in the story, in the narrative, is that prior to this, you have NASA and the Soviets sending all these probes to the moon. And some of them are hitting, and some of them are just, flying wildly by. And the problem, as far as I can tell, is that it's not that the engineers were incompetent. It's not that they couldn't hit the dang thing. It's a pretty big target that you're trying to hit here. Okay. The problem is they were, in my opinion, miscalculating the actual mass of the moon. And this is what I think got Werner von Braun resigned from NASA, is that little interview he gave to Time magazine after the Apollo 11 landings, when von Braun let it slip that the neutral point of gravity between the Earth and the moon was about 43,000 some odd miles between, from the surface of the moon. And if that's the case, then the moon is not the 1/6 gravity that we've been told. Plus, the other problem with the moon, as they discovered, was once they were able to get satellites up there and going around the dang thing and snapping pictures of, oh, we want to land here and we want to land there. Remember, that's what Apollo 8 was all about. They also discovered that there were concentrations of mass underneath the surface of the moon. They're called mass cons. You can look it up. Well, why do you have such a high variation of local gravitational acceleration under the surface of the moon. What's going on there? In other words, it's not a uniform body where the surface acceleration of gravity is more or less the same everywhere within, a few decimal points. It's something very different. So you've got satellites, so to speak, that actually, as they're going over these areas, actually dip in their telemetry. So, the moon is throwing off all sorts of bad telemetry here, folks, that you've got to get a grip on. And I
Meaning
don't think,
maybe that the moon is closer to Earth than what it's been portrayed.
no, meaning that the celestial mechanics are all different
Mm.
than what they were assuming they were. So in other words, people ask me this all the time, Ryder, and have I seen a UFO? Well, the answer is yes. But my usual answer is yeah, every time there's a full moon. Because how did the dang thing get there? you know, if you stop and think about the physics of it, and there are a few scientists that are honest about this, but you have to dig for them. One of them was Isaac Asimov, the other one was Isaac Newton, and then you have a whole slew of Russians that were honest enough to admit what the problem was. You've got two basic models of how the moon got there in scientific theory. And I'm putting quotation marks around scientific for reasons that will become evident. You've got the Fisher theory, where the moon breaks out of the Pacific basin of the Earth and ends up there doing what it's doing somehow for some reason. Okay. So one of the things that the moon rocks supposedly proved, well, no, the moon couldn't have done that because the moon rocks that we have are older than the planet Earth. Whoops. The other idea is the moon came gallivanting through the solar system at some point in prehistory and was captured by the Earth's gravity, okay, and ended up doing what it's doing. All right. So on the capture model, pay attention now to the physics. You're coming in, and as you're approaching this planet that's going to capture you, what happens gravitationally? Well, as you approach the planet, you accelerate. As you accelerate and you're captured by the planet, that means that you're like a bowling ball or a golf ball that's going to rim around the cup as you're putting, and it's going to make this big elliptical orbit. It's going to go closer to the planet and speed up as it does so. And as it goes away from the planet, it's going to slow down and then back, like this around the cup. The problem is the moon ain't doing that. The moon is in a nearly perfect circular orbit. It's rotating on its own axis, but it's doing so in such a way that as it's going around the Earth, only 60% of the surface of the moon is visible from this planet at any one time, and it's the same surface. So in other words, the rotation is coordinated to the rotation around the Earth. And it's also parked conveniently enough, and notice the word park here. It's parked conveniently enough so that during a solar eclipse, it is of exactly the right position and place and size to blot out all but the edge corona of the sun itself. And all of this is supposedly what happened by chance. No, folks, I'm sorry. If you're believing all of that, you're believing a lot of malarkey. Someone parked it there. And if they parked it there, then that means someone has some pretty sophisticated technology. In other words, to get it to do what it's doing, you had to put on the brakes at some point and slow the dang thing down and position it just so.
Wasn't it Werner von Braun that made that statement, or maybe it was someone else? I might be mixing it up here. That the moon's gravitational pull would, it's kind of like what you're talking about. It would suck the rocket in like a bowling ball if it ran
Right.
out of gas, and it would
Right.
push it rest of the way to the moon.
Right. Yeah. That's exactly what he said when he gave his interview to Time magazine. But the numbers he gave were not the numbers, he's letting out a secret there that he shouldn't have, and Time is just going ahead and reporting it.
Mhm.
But the numbers he gave, if you run them, will tell you that the 1/6 gravity. I grew up reading the weekly readers, all about how we're going to go to the moon, and by golly, it's going to be 1/6 the gravity of the Earth, and people are going to be able to leap tall buildings with a single bound. The whole 9 yards. And you're going to be able to drive golf balls, miles on the moon, and jump, tall jumps. So we were fed this propaganda before the moon landings about what we would be able to do and not do once we get there.
Mm.
So once we get there, what do you see? Well, you see these astronauts jumping around, but they're not jumping tall buildings. They actually took a golf ball. I forget which mission it was, but some astronaut took a golf club and a golf ball just just to drive the golf ball to satisfy all the weekly reader school kids out there, me being one of them. They did all of this stuff because, in my opinion, they had prepped a narrative using the wrong figures and therefore the wrong celestial mechanics. And here's the problem: if the moon is 1/6 the gravity of the Earth and not a little bit more than we were told, then that's going to throw off the fuel calculations of how much fuel you need to get off the moon. And I strongly suspect it's a lot more fuel than you have in the little lunar excursion module that just pops up and flies away like it's on strings. No, it ain't going to
Yeah.
work.
Yeah, I'll have to go back and do more research into the Gemini programs and those early test flights of the Air Force because, from what I remember, I do not believe that they went outside of the orbit of Earth. They just went.
Well, they didn't go outside the orbit of Earth, but your earlier statement was, did they do enough testing of these things? And virtually every maneuver that was done in the Gemini project was done in anticipation of what they would have to do for Apollo. So in other words, if you look at the way Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo were set up, these were all a very carefully thought out progression in a technology and operational tree that they needed to do before they could get to the moon using that technology. Um, it was very carefully thought out, and I remember as a kid watching Walter Cronkite and occasionally Richard Hoagland, as a matter of fact, on these Gemini broadcasts, particularly the ones where they were going to try the docking maneuver. And they very carefully explained, well, we're doing all of these different things up there because each one is a necessary step that we need to be able to do before we can go on to the next step that's going to get us to the moon. So, this was all thought out very, very carefully. And if you look at what the Soviets were doing, they were doing more or less the same thing. What's really interesting is when you compare the Soviet space schedule to the American space schedule.
Mm.
And I wrote about this in SS Brotherhood of the Barrel. SS Brotherhood of the Bell. They'd send up a few space programs, then they probes, and then they'd quit, and we'd send up a few, then we'd quit, and then the Soviets would send up. And you can look at that one of two ways. You can look at it as this is the Cold War competition, and that's the evidence, or you can look at it as coordination behind the scenes. There's no other way to do it.
Absolutely. So now I heard Daniel speak about this first, and I think it's important to mention to give him credit here. But he made the statement in one of his videos, was a quote from Lyndon B. Johnson before he ran on the ticket with JFK January 7th,
Mm-hmm.
1958, speaking to the Senate Democratic Caucus, which is very interesting. And I'm paraphrasing here because I don't have the quote directly in front of me. But what he said was pretty much that the control of space means control of the world. And from
Yes.
space, we have the power to control Earth's weather, causing droughts and floods, change the tides, raise the level of the sea, even divert the Gulf Stream,
All right.
and change the climate. And that space is basically the ultimate position, and that the it would be total control of Earth, and that the national goal should be to win and hold that position. Now, I find this wording very interesting here, Joseph,
Mm-hmm.
that the goal should be to win and
Mm-hmm.
hold that position. Now, I don't know about you, but winning something implies that there's an opposing force already there.
Yes.
So, my question is, who would we need to win space from?
From, well, Johnson made several statements like that, not just in 1958, but when he became Senate Majority Leader, he began his push for space because he recognized that it would be the high ground. Uh, so, in other words, in terms of space, anything off of this planet, this planet is a gravity well. So, in other words, it's a sink in local space. So, anything out there is the high ground. You know, Robert Heinlein wrote his novel "The Moon is a Harsh Mistress" about a human colony on the moon that revolts and is able to get Earth to accept it by threatening Earth literally with pushing a few marbles down the hill. In other words, bombarding the Earth. All it takes is, lob a rock off the moon towards the Earth and let the Earth's gravity do the rest. So, who's out there? Well, in my opinion, at that time, you could stretch a case that maybe the Nazis did, but again, there are a lot of people arguing that, and I've never been one of them. You'd have to stress and stretch the technology that they came up with to the snapping point. So that leaves what I call our genetic cousins. Um, there, the situation is different because we have texts going back millennia that indicate that something happened previously in human history with somebody, in my opinion, somebody out there. Um, so my guess is if we're going to win it back, it's from those people. And I've always maintained the position, Ryder, that the the post-war national security state in this country faced three strategic problems, and they had to deal with all these problems in one fell swoop, and space was the key. They had the communist bloc, of course. They had this post-war Nazi thing. I don't know what else to call it other than an extraterritorial state, which it was, doing its thing very clearly. And thirdly, they had a UFO problem that, in terms of its apparent technological capability, exceeded anything that they knew the Nazis had achieved. So they've got a threefold problem. So how to take care of it? Well, the first thing that you've got to do is you've got to have a reconnaissance platform that can keep tabs on all three potential threats. Answer: spy satellites. That to me is the key right there as to what they're up to. Then you have the Brookings report, which if you've ever sat down to actually read the thing, it rewards reading, because they're not only concerned about extraterrestrial artifacts, but they talk about things like magnetohydrodynamic drive. What's that doing there? When they're concerned with the Soviets launching rockets. Why that? Where's that coming from? Answer: I suspect whatever they're getting from the Nazis, whatever they've learned from people like Thomas Townsend Brown and Nikola Tesla and so on, that's why that's there. And then thirdly, they're worried about potential repercussions of any sort of extraterrestrial contact via artifacts or actual contact. So, in other words, all those threats are there in the Brookings report. That's what I'm trying to get across here.
Also, what's really interesting too is in 1961, the Air Force started a strategic air command with the code name Looking Glass on,
Yes.
I believe, February 3rd, 1961, using the Boeing
Right.
135C aircraft. Now, people in the community, especially in the secret space program and the super soldier community asset, bullshit nonsense, have taken that Looking Glass title and turned it into something that's not, right?
Right.
Like a device that can see into the future and the past and all that fairy tale nonsense stuff. But really, what the Looking Glass project or Operation Looking Glass is a code name used for an airborne
An airborne. Right.
command control center for
Center.
space
Right.
nukes, right?
Right.
Which is the beginning. In the beginning of Looking Glass, it was overseen by the Air Force, and now it's officially called Airborne National Command Post, and provides
Right.
command and control for U.S. nuclear forces in space in the event that somehow ground-based centers have been destroyed
Right.
or rendered unusable. And at that very time in 1961, the Air Force was doing their test flights
Right.
we're in space too with the Gemini and the Mercury test flights. So it's a
Yep.
multi-layered thing. The Air Force in 1961 were not only doing test flights for NASA, but they were also creating a command control center to be able to launch nukes from
Right.
space.
Right. Right. Well, let's remember in that respect, let's remember what Colonel Corso said in his book The Day After Roswell.
Yes.
Now, I'm not one of those people that entirely dismisses what Colonel Corso said in that book. In fact, I wish people in ufology would read the book much more closely than they have. Okay. Because the frustrating thing about Corso's book is in the same sentence, he can oftentimes be talking about aliens, at the beginning of the sentence. And by the time you get to the end of the sentence, you're talking about Nazis.
Yeah.
And this goes on constantly. Well, what's the deal, Colonel Corso? But one of the things that really leapt out at me in that book was his assertion that, and again, like many of the things that he says in the book, it's just asserted. It's not argued. It's not really documented well. It's just asserted. But it does make sense when you stop and think about it. He asserts that the reason that this country and the Soviet Union built such massive stockpiles of strategic nuclear weapons at the time he was writing, both countries with anywhere from 15 to 20,000 strategic, nuclear weapons. The reason that he gives for both countries doing that was so that in case of an alien invasion where one country was taken over, the other country would be able to overwhelm any alien invader by sheer numbers of nuclear warheads. That is what he states.
Wow.
Now, I don't know if that's true or not. However, given the insanity that we see having taken root in Swampington, D.C., after the assassination of President Kennedy, it makes perfect sense to me, particularly when you have people at that time like Curtis LeMay, who comes up with this strategic integrated operational plan that Eisenhower finally was allowed to see, and Eisenhower himself was appalled at what the response to the Warsaw Pact invading Europe would be. The response was launch everything, turn the entire communist bloc into a radioactive cinder. That was the plan.
Wow.
So yeah, I can readily think that Colonel Corso may be onto something, that this was their thinking. Put quotation marks around thinking.
Yeah, it's just really interesting with Lyndon B. Johnson making these remarks about the superposition of
Right.
space, being able to control the tides. I mean, what controls the tides? The moon controls the tides, right? So
The
what if,
moon controls the tides. Well, again, Johnson, if you read the Brookings report, it's very clear that one of the things that they're thinking about is control of space for military purposes. Why? one of the key things in the Brookings report, and I talk about this in Covert Wars and Clash of Civilizations, one of those two books, but one of the things that they're talking about are weather satellites and communications satellites. Now, under communications, understand financial clearing. They want to move all of their clearing eventually to space. We're seeing this program now with central bank digital currencies. They want to move everything off planet so that they have complete control. I've got bad news for them. It ain't going to happen. You guys are playing with fire, literally. But once they mention communications, that's what gives the game away. Why? Because in order to protect those assets, you're going to have to protect them. You're going to have to weaponize space. And there's another reason you want to have communications and financial clearing assets out there. And that's because you might be conducting trade with somebody. Where's all this money been going?
Right.
You know, how much electricity can you put into a circuit and then bleed out of the circuit and have it just simply disappear? Can't be done. Where's it going? Well, I'm with Catherine Fitz. I think a lot of it for a long time, for some reason, has been going off planet.
And then
And
boom, up pops Space Force. Now they're
boom,
kind
out
of
pops Space Force. Yeah. And it, let's remember what President Trump actually said. He said, yeah, and we need another Space Force. Whoa, another? we already have one, and that's not good enough. So we have a Coast Guard now, and now we need a Navy, is what you're telling us, huh?
Yeah, the I think the Space Force is obviously a rebranding of something that was previously
Oh yeah,
already there. That was
yeah,
classified. That was a part of a space
right.
special access program, and then they just brought it public and renamed it Space Force.
Well, Gary Allen in the United Kingdom, the hacker, back years ago when he hacked into NASA, he claims, well, he found captains and ships and crews and so on and so forth of something that the U.S. Department of Defense was supposedly running out there in terms of a space force. And let's not forget Ronald Reagan's memoirs. Reagan, bless his heart, had a bad tendency to blab, and how this one got past the censors, I'll never figure out unless they wanted it to, which is likely. But in his memoirs, Reagan says, and I was informed, something to this effect, that we had a space lift launch capacity of about 300 people. That's way beyond the space shuttle capacity that we had at the time, which was what, 36, 30, 40, somewhere in there. That's way, 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 and that's like an airliner full of people that you can put into space. So something was going on there. So yeah, I'm with you. I think they had to rebrand and let out that they've got something up there. And then General Milley, thoroughly modern Milley, as I like to call him after the Mary Tyler Moore musical. But anyway, thoroughly modern Milley a few years ago gives that strange speech to the U.S. Air Force Academy, or the West Point, I forget which it was, where he talks about the soldiers, you soldiers of the future are going to have to learn to fight little green men.
Yeah.
And and then the Army comes out and has the gall to tell us, well, what he was really referring to is Army code talk for the camouflage uniforms of Russian soldiers.
Nice cover
No.
there.
Yeah. You can do better than that, guys. Come on.
Another thing that's also interesting that I found, that wrapping this back around to JFK and
Mhm.
Lyndon B. Johnson, is in 1963, before the assassination, JFK awarded and Lyndon B. Johnson presented Robert Oppenheimer with the Fermi Award for
Mm-hmm.
basically creating nukes during the Manhattan Project in the mid
Mm-hmm.
40s. It's a
Mm-hmm.
crazy little side note there.
Well, it to me, it's narrative reinforcement because I actually think the Nazis beat us to the bomb.
Yeah.
I think the Nazis detonated a bomb in October of 1944, as a matter of fact. But and, we do know that they had the uranium enrichment and refinement process down to the point that Nazi uranium that was recovered from the U-boat making its way to Japan ended up in the Manhattan Project. Uh, Absolutely. So if they didn't detonate a bomb, they were capable of it. So I think the whole Robert Oppenheimer thing was a bit of narrative reinforcement to take away too much scrutiny of what actually did we recover from those people. We recovered quite a lot, and nuclear weapons being but one small portion of it.
Yeah, I agree. But it's interesting how during that time frame that JFK and Lyndon B. Johnson are giving him that award,
Oh yeah,
we're also doing the looking glass technology,
oh
which
yeah,
which was arming space with the ability to launch nukes from Earth.
yeah,
And it's
yeah.
really interesting when you're putting those pieces together.
Well, I'll go further. If you need a command facility infrastructure to be able to launch nuclear weapons from space, I think ultimately that includes the ability to literally position nuclear weapons there and launch them from there. There's If you stop and think about it, that's a much more efficient way to get the job done
Yep.
than ICBMs. And while we're on the topic, why bother going to all this engineering difficulty of putting a hydrogen bomb on a satellite and dropping it? Why not just drop tungsten rods? Rods of God. They'll do the same job, no nasty radioactive fallout, and so on and so forth. And as kinetic weapons, they are also, in my opinion, much more readily lendable to targeting things not on the surface of this planet, but out there. So that's my thinking is Project Looking Glass has dimensions to it that we have not yet been told. And I have no doubt the same probably applies to the Russians, the Chinese, and anybody else that has the technology that they're not just concerned with nuclear weapons here. They're concerned with something out there.
Right, a
Right.
multi-layered operation, not only concerned with Earth, but also concerned
Right.
with any other
Absolutely.
human, people that might be outside of Earth as well.
Right.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I want to kind of get into the actual assassination of JFK here because I found this really interesting. I was doing a lot of research into this, and I discovered that 5 days after JFK was assassinated, November 22nd, 1963, 5 days later, there was a reenactment of the assassination, right? Secret Service did a reenactment of the Kennedy assassination on November 27th, 1963, in Dealey Plaza. Now, why in the world would a Secret Service do a reenactment of the JFK assassination 5 days after the real assassination with all the same Secret Service members? There's pictures and footage of the reenactment
Mm-hmm.
online, right? To me, Joseph, that would be like building a replica of the Twin Towers 5 days after 9/11 in 2001 and flying planes into them again.
Mm-hmm.
Makes
Mm-hmm.
absolutely no sense. What do you think about that?
Well, I that's an aspect of the assassination I have not studied nor looked into. But my guess would be that given what we now know of the extent of government complicity in the deed, And given what we now know of the Secret Service being quite literally warned off of providing its normal security coverage for the president, my guess is that what you have there is narrative preparation. In other words, they're going through this process for two purposes. Number one, as a palliative to reassure the public that the upcoming snow job that we call the Warren report is going to be received. Oh well, we looked at all of this, and this is supporting the Warren Commission conclusion. The other target of an operation like that, I strongly suspect, would be to convince the Secret Service team members themselves that the narrative that's going to come out is the correct narrative. So in other words, you have two audiences you've got to convince. You've got to convince the security people that are not in on the plan, and then you've got to convince the American public. That's my guess, and it's only a guess. That may change if I look at it in more detail.
Now, this one's really interesting and really wild that they did this. The FBI did another reenactment a year
Yes,
later in 1964, May 24th of 1964 in Dealey Plaza, where they actually used Oswald's real
yes.
murder weapon, the
His
rifle.
alleged real murder weapon.
Yes, alleged in the reenactment, right? And they
Yeah,
recorded that reenactment for the Warren Commission during the
yes, that's
reconstruction of the
true.
assassination. Now, now again, allegedly they used the real rifle, but when in the history of any crime investigation would you use an actual real murder weapon? The only real piece of evidence linking Oswald to the assassination, less than a year in the reenactment of one of the biggest crimes and assassinations in U.S. history.
Well, you do so if you were trying to prove that your ridiculous narrative was in fact possible. And of course, we both know that they were unable to produce the wonderful shooting feat that Lee Harvey Oswald supposedly accomplished using a 6.5 Italian Mannlicher Carcano bolt action rifle with a misaligned telescope, firing off three shots in 6.7 seconds or whatever the number was. No. And there's, of course, the other teensy weensy problem that everybody who first saw the alleged murder weapon kept referring to it as a 7.65 Mauser. Okay. So somewhere we changed brand names, we changed countries manufacturing the dang thing, and we changed the caliber of the rifle. Um, I strongly suspect that what was going on there was a last minute detail foul up. Why? Because by that point, Jack Ruby has planted the 6.5 caliber magic bullet on the stretcher at Parkland Hospital. And oops, folks, we'd better change that Mauser real fast. so, so get rid of the Mauser and substitute the Mannlicher Carcano. And besides that, we know that Lee's double ordered one of the dang things, and we took his picture. So yeah, the whole thing is such a tapestry of either poor planning or deliberate in your face lying, and I suspect there's a good case to be made for the latter as well. Absolutely.
It's the most convoluted thing to research ever. I
It's
believe it's
yeah, it's worse than the 9/11 story. I mean,
yeah.
when you get right down to it, it's just bad. And the sad thing is Kennedy, um there's all of these strange warnings that he's being given prior to this happening, and he goes ahead with it anyway. He if I were him, no way am I riding in that dang limousine through Dallas, Texas, of all places, without the bubble top. I mean, come on. It's just no, no, ain't happening.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that he made a comment before the assassination to one of the Secret Service members that the mob was after him and had a hit out on him. I don't know if that's true or not. Maybe just be
Everybody was
speculating.
after him. there wasn't there wasn't a group of people in the country that he hadn't pissed off somehow. But I don't know if you've ever seen a documentary called Evidence of Revision. Have you ever seen that
No, I
documentary?
haven't.
Okay, it's worth your time to go watch because they cover the three major assassinations, but most of it is on Kennedy. And all it is, with a very minimum of commentary, all it is a chronological presentation of the major news media coverage of every event on that day, beginning with his appearance in Fort Worth, to the Texas, whatever it was that he was addressing, and then the flight to Love Field. What really comes out in that presentation is how the narrative is already being prepped by the news commentators. Why? Because when they're talking about President Kennedy at Fort Worth, guess what they're talking about?
Hmm.
The assassination of President McKinley by a lone nut.
Wow.
Literally, that's what they're talking about. And then by the time you get to Walter Cronkite after the assassination, talking about what's going on, you get him in the process of talking first about the Mauser, then about the Mannlicher Carchanto. He can't even pronounce it correctly. And then you get him taking off his glasses in the most serious of American lamestream propaganda controlled media fashions, worthy of MSNBC. You see him taking off his glasses and quoting the communist shill, the Kremlin spokesman, Vladimir Zorin, who incidentally was the Soviet ambassador to the UN Security Council during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you get Cronkite quoting Vladimir Zorin, who is talking about the security stripping of President Kennedy on the day of the assassination. So it's obvious to the communist shill, and it's not obvious, or at least apparently not obvious, to Walter Cronkite of CBS News. They don't call it CBS for nothing, folks. So yeah, it's so apparently and egregiously a fake narrative, and it's apparent on the day that they start covering. I was home from school sick when it happened. I watched all of it. And I'm thinking, and my mother is watching all of this, and I'm thinking, this makes no sense. I'm 6 years old and it makes no sense to me. You know, nuts.
It really doesn't make any sense at all. And
No.
and these reenactments really lay a completely other layer into this whole thing and really brings into question the authenticity of this Zapruder film, right?
Oh
Muddies
yeah. Oh, big
muddies
time.
muddies the waters between what was real and what was reenactment. I mean, even the with Sean Stone's footage from the reenactment of his movie, people were trying to pass off some of that footage and
Yeah.
pictures as real. So I know for a fact the Secret Service did a reenactment November 27th,
Yeah.
1963, and the FBI did another reenactment May 24th of 1964 using allegedly the real weapon that Oswald supposedly used
Well,
to fire the shots.
that may be one reason they did the reenactment is the
Mm.
Zapruder film. That
Yep.
there are no less, by my last count, there are 6 different versions of the dang thing out there,
Yep.
and probably more once you get right down to it. So no one can claim to have an unadulterated, pristine, prime copy of the dang thing.
Yeah, I think the
And
only people that did have the original copy was the Secret Service and the
yeah,
FBI, but I could be wrong about that. But I believe that these reenactment photos and footage has been mixed in with real
Oh,
footage from the
absolutely.
assassination to muddy the waters
Probably.
to create confusion,
Yeah,
right?
sure. Sure, you could do that. You could do that very easily. The thing that always interests me about the film is first of all, film is not good evidence. It would not be considered that way in courts of law. The eyewitness testimony would be given much more prominence in any court of law over a film. But what's interesting to me about the films is there are at least two others that no one has ever seen or talk about. There's Nix's film, the deaf guy that was filming, and then there's a film that was taken by someone all the way across Dealey Plaza. I forget what the name of that individual was, but these films have never turned up. They were confiscated and they've just disappeared. So
And also, if you watch the Zapruder film in its entirety, you'll see that there's a cut in the footage,
oh
right?
yeah,
Whenever the motorcade goes behind the
the
freeway sign.
sign.
And if you talk to anyone that's a filmmaker, they'll tell you that it's not authentic because there's a cut in the film.
There's
It
a
means
cut.
means it's intentional and anything can be placed in the film after that cut. And then also if you pay attention to the background of the Zapruder film after the cut, everyone that's in the background that's standing on the
It's shifted.
sidewalk or on the grass, they're bigger in frame than the people that's in the foreground, which is impossible. People further away in the shot can't be bigger or just as big as the
Well,
people
there's
that's
a
in the
good question
foreground of
as
the
to
shot.
why the cut. Well, one reason you take a cut is if there's a bullet hole in the sign, just get that out of there. There, yeah, there's all sorts of problems with the Zapruder film. The people, as you say, the changing perspectives. There's slightly different perspectives on it. So yeah, as 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 evidence, it's pretty poor value. Um, that may even be the reason because Garrison was the one that did show it during the Clay Shaw trial. That's where it got its first public exposure. And that may be one of the reasons why the trial was unsuccessful. I don't know because the other thing that's very peculiar is that no one, to my knowledge, Ryder has gone and got a hold of the trial transcripts themselves
Right.
and looked at them carefully and in a detailed fashion. That would tell a lot.
When was that Clay Shaw trial? Was that in 69?
1967.
67. Okay, yeah, I
Yeah.
had that wrong. And but it wasn't made public until I believe the 70s by
It
Ronaldo
was,
Rivera, right?
well, Geraldo, I think, was the one that made it public, but it became part of the public record during the Clay Shaw trial. And Geraldo, if I'm not mistaken, used the version that, oh, what's his name? One of the famous JFK Robert something or other, and I
Yeah.
can't remember his last name, but I think the version that Geraldo used was that version that this assassination researcher has used.
Another interesting piece of this whole thing is the France Z film and Jack Valente. I'm sure you're familiar with the Z film, the Algerian political thriller about the assassination of that politician,
De Gaulle?
Lambrascus, I think is his last name in 1963. But the interesting part of that whole thing is Jack Valenti's interest in the film, right? He had the FBI involved and raided the Black Panthers looking for this stolen copy of this political Algerian Z film.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the interesting part is why would Jack Valente be so concerned about an Algerian political film, unless maybe
Well,
somehow.
I don't know enough about this film. In fact, I don't think I've heard of it until you mentioned it just now. So I'll have to go and study this. But my guess is uh, when you mention Algeria, all sorts of alarm bells go off for me because I don't know how familiar you are with the Organisation Armée Secrète or the OAS. It was a French military cabal that was opposed to General de Gaulle, to President de Gaulle, and his plans to allow Algeria its independence from metropolitan France. So you had a bunch of French officers, primarily in Algeria, some in metropolitan France, that formed this group called the Organisation Armée Secrète, the secret army organization. And they in turn hatched numerous plots to assassinate President de Gaulle. The movie The Jackal, the assassination attempt on de Gaulle from the Jackal, was part and parcel of one of their operations. But the OAS, de Gaulle's security service, after all of these assassination attempts, de Gaulle's intelligence services shut down the OAS, actually put some of them on trial, and even executed one of them. But when the Kennedy assassination occurred, de Gaulle's security services noticed a number of connections of people involved in Kennedy's assassination to the OAS. And some of those connections involved, here it comes, folks, some of those connections involved Reinhard Gehlen. Yeah. Ding, ding, ding. So, here's this Nazi general involved in assassination attempts on de Gaulle, and he's also the security and private intelligence service for the Texas oil men. So, it's whatever's going on with Kennedy, it's exactly like Jack Ruby said it was. It's bigger than you can possibly imagine.
There's just a lot of secrecy revolving around the original copy of the Zapruder film.
Oh yeah.
There's something going on there that I haven't quite put together or done enough research into, but apparently this original copy is very, very important, and they don't want the public to see it. And my whole spiel there about France and the Z film was that apparently France had a copy or an original stolen copy of the JFK assassination, and apparently that's why Jack Valente was really interested in finding it and got the FBI involved to find this supposed Z film.
Now
So
that you mentioned that, as I recall, I talked about the Zapruder film in my LBJ and the Conspiracy to Kill Kennedy book, and as I recall, at some point in my research, I do recall reading that some copy of the Zapruder film did make it into the French security services hands. Now, whether it was an original, I don't know, but uh, the French intelligence services would have been easily capable of telling President de Gaulle whether or not the copy they had was an undoctored or an edited copy. That much we do know. So I'm not surprised that you would have this Valente character interested in the film for that reason. And let's go further. If France has such a copy, it's intriguing to note that they have never let it out. What we have from France, interestingly enough, are books that were published in France shortly after the assassination, before the Warren Commission even, printed a word, that were clearly blaming a conspiracy, number one, and clearly blaming elements of the American deep state that were connected to the OAS, number two. So France knew something. De Gaulle knew something right out of the gate. There's no doubt in my mind. And obviously the Soviets did too. So something big going on that is still being covered up. What I wish we could get out of the foreign powers is what their intelligence assessments were at the time.
yes,
I am willing to bet you, Ryder, that none of them, absolutely none of them concluded that this was the work of a lone nut assassin. Not the Japanese, not the French, not the Germans, not the Italians, not the British, not the Chinese, none of them.
I absolutely agree. And also, the we have to remember that the FBI made copies of the film too.
Yeah.
So there's second gen and third gen copies,
Yep.
and I'm completely convinced that the public has never seen the original, and
No.
every one of the
Yep.
generations of the film are reenactments and that the Secret Service and the FBI did and passed them off as the real thing.
Robert Groden was the name of the guy I was trying to think of earlier. Yeah, I'm in complete agreement with you. I don't think we have an undoctored copy of the Zapruder film. Now, as far as I know, most people think that Groden's version is the closest because it's the version with the most frames. But even there, if I'm not mistaken, it's very clear that there are frames that are removed and there are frames that have been duplicated to replace the removed frames. So we're dealing with a very heavily doctored piece of quote unquote evidence. Um, the problem with the Zapruder film is that there, in any of its versions that I'm familiar with, and probably you are too, is that in none of them do we see produced what eyewitnesses saw, and that was the complete stoppage of the limousine on
Just
Elm
keeps
Street.
going.
It
Yeah.
just keeps going. Right. Yeah. And again, if you've got that kind of conflict between an alleged film of an incident and eyewitness testimony, the weight of evidentiary rule has to fall with the eyewitnesses. Has to.
And also not releasing it to the public.
Right.
Well, in that court case in 67, but not officially to the public wide
Right.
view until the 70s. It allowed enough time to lapse in between there for people to kind of forget what happened, and it just became a word of mouth thing so that they could put out the fake
Well,
doctored footage.
it was highlighted in a Life mag. I remember when this Life magazine came out with a special edition with stills from the Zapruder film, and it came out either in 64 or 65 before the trial. But there again, you're not dealing with the actual film, you're dealing with an edited selection of frames from the film. And if you're able to find that version of Life magazine, what's really interesting is none of the selected frames really have much evidentiary value in the selection at all. So, in other words, again, the narrative is being hammered in every way that the media can hammer the narrative. And that ought to tell us something about what wonderful truth tellers they are now. you know, you're watching the whole Kennedy assassination, as far as I'm concerned, is you're watching Operation Mockingbird at work.
Mhm. Absolutely. And another interesting thing is whenever I believe it was the Warren Commission that was doing their investigation into the JFK assassination, the Secret Service sent them a copy of the film, the Zapruder film, and they went back to the Secret Service and asked and told them that the footage was too blurry, that
Mm-hmm.
they couldn't make anything out on it. And then they requested a much clearer copy. So why would the Secret Service not give them the much clearer copy
Copy to begin
for
with.
to begin
And for that matter, where did the clear copy come from?
Yep.
You know, I'll be honest with you. I'm so skeptical of virtually every portion of this narrative. I wonder if there wasn't somebody else standing behind Abraham Zapruder in approximately the same position, taking yet another film. Who knows? You know, at this point, it's so ridiculous. Maybe the guy on the grassy knoll, with the badge man picture shooting the gun, maybe he had an automatic camera going at the same. Who knows? The whole thing is so cockeyed. And since we're talking about films, like I said earlier, where are the other films that were taken there? Why have they never been discussed? And there's not even a doctored version of them out there to watch. Why?
Yeah.
Why?
I agree so much, and the muddying of the waters of both
Yep.
of those reenactments have just it's completely blown this thing to a whole other level, right? It's
Yeah. It was a coup d'etat. Let's admit what it was. This country became a banana republic for all to see on November 22nd, 1963. And it's been a banana republic ever since. And screw you people who want to vote for Orange Man bad, because if you do, we're just going to steal the election anyway. And if you believe there was voter fraud, I'm one of those. If you believe that that's how this corrupt, grifting criminal got into the White House, I'm one of those. Uh too bad. You're just a conspiracy theorist. Well, I'm a conspiracy theorist with a past. I've seen it happen before. So I put nothing past them.
there's one other thing before I let you go here today, Joseph, is that I did some research on the Boston bombing. You remember
Oh
in
boy, yeah, uh-huh.
April of 2013, right?
Uh-huh.
And what is very, very interesting about the Boston bombing that very few people are even aware of is that there was a third bomb that went off.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that third bomb went off at JFK Memorial Library in
Library,
Boston,
yep.
right?
Yep.
It's very, very little known that there was a third bomb that went off at the JFK Memorial Library, and very few articles about this online. But it happened, and they tried to
Yep.
play this off as like a fire. But the police spokeswoman in Boston at the time, on record, and other policemen on record, has stated that another bomb went off at JFK Memorial Library. And me putting this together, I'm thinking that the whole Boston Marathon bombing was a distraction to
Yep.
eliminate whatever records or
Yep.
footage that was stocked and filed away at the JFK Memorial Library in
Oh,
Boston.
I totally agree. Yeah, I Dark Journalist told me about that a few years ago, and I was dumbfounded when he told me that, because where I'm at, the news had not mentioned that at all. Neither the local feeds, the wire services, which I at that time used to follow rather carefully, because oftentimes things would appear in the wire service that would make your local newscasts. Um, I when I was told that, I was dumbfounded, and I'm with you that whatever was going on there, there was something that they had to get rid of in the JFK library.
Yep.
The problem that they have is truth always outs. Always. There's always a footnote or an exception or a black swan somewhere that is going to put the monkey wrench into the narrative. They cannot destroy all records. This is their problem. And the more they keep doing this, the more they make it obvious that what did happen in Dallas on that day was a conspiracy, and it could not possibly have been coordinated by Fidel Castro or Nikita Khrushchev. I mean, it just doesn't happen that way. And they wouldn't have risked the consequences to do so anyway. So whatever was in that library, we can only guess at. I suspect eventually we're going to learn a lot more. That things are going to come out, and people are going to notice, like the whole McCarthy committee transcripts, and the constant references to Roswell and what was going on there in those. That dumbfounded me, and it was repeatedly. In other words, it was not an accidental thing that just got mentioned and then later forgotten. This was a constant focus in some of those hearings, and this is the reason it's classified. There's no doubt in my mind. Forget what they've been telling you in the history books and on the media. This is what was going on. So there there had to be something there in those archives that had to get buried. And at the time that occurred, who knows what it may have been. I'll be honest, Ryder. I have I have suspicions, deep suspicions, about the JFK Jr. plane accident. Uh, there are obvious problems there, big ones. His association in turn with Donald Trump is weird. Donald Trump's association with Roy Cohn is weird. Cohn, chief counsel for Senator McCarthy. What's going on here? This is like a bad Mozart opera. Everybody's in disguise and, cheating on everybody else. And we don't know what the plot is until they all take their masks off at the end of the opera. I mean, uh, it's Looney Tunes. So I'm
Well,
with you. Something happened at that library, and they're covering more up.
and it had to be something very, very important. It had to be
Had to be, yeah.
something that nobody is even on base with, something
Right.
that is that would be completely shocking, that would change everything. And i'm I'm not convinced that it has anything to do with UFOs or advanced technology, because why would that be such a shocking revelation? I don't think that that would be a shocking revelation to the public and the people in the community. I mean, people have been talking about that the government's covering up advanced technology for a really long time, right? I don't think that that's shocking enough to warrant the explosion happening at
Well,
JFK
let's
Memorial Library.
expand your speculation, because I think your speculation is sound. Let's expand it for a minute. Because if they're willing to create a massive distraction like that and literally murder innocent people to get rid of an incriminating document or series of documents, or even here it comes, even a record that such documents exist and exist in a place of public access, then what that tells me is they're afraid of someone tracing something. So in other words, I strongly suspect that even though they did that they have not been successful of erasing the record of the existence of whatever it was that they got rid of. So in other words, somebody with a real nose for some real detective work needs to get into that library and go through their records post and pre Boston bombing very carefully.
Yep.
And that will tell us a heck of a lot. And to my knowledge, nobody's done that. But I agree with you. I think it's got to be something else. And my suspicion would be on the nature of uh, people in the Kennedy network that have been overlooked. I'll be honest. I was never a big Teddy Kennedy fan, but there's something about that man that bothers me. And I think that they pulled so many numbers on him that he just finally gave up. He did not start out the big, well, one example in particular, abortion. He did not start out the big pro abortion liberal that he later became. That was after his airplane accident. Gee, where we heard that in connection to the Kennedy family. And then, of course, Chappaquiddick and all of that. There's something going on with him too that I've never been completely satisfied with. That the explanations are legit. Um, the one I'm worried about now is Robert Kennedy Jr. because again, you're dealing with another Kennedy with his own ideas, and he's not following the narrative. you know,
Absolutely not. I don't think he's ever followed the narrative.
Well, I don't think so either. Whatever the narrative is, he's not following it. But yeah, I agree with you. There's something in those records that they had to get rid of. And I tend to think that you're probably right. It's not the UFO and technology angle. It's something else altogether.
It is definitely something else, and we'll have to put a pin in that when hopefully more information arises and we can try and figure it out. I'd love to bring you back on sometime in the
Sure.
future. Thanks so much for coming on my show,
Well,
Joseph.
thanks for having me back, Ryder. I appreciate it. It's been enjoyable.
Yes, I very much enjoyed it. I hope everyone else enjoyed it too. Let people know where they can purchase your books. Plug your website.
My website is www.gizadeathstar.com. All of my books are there on the website. Some of them will come from this publisher, some from the other publisher. I've got a new book coming out with Adventures Unlimited. My dog is whining. I've got a new book coming out from Adventures Unlimited probably sometime next month. Um, and maybe another one in the works for this year. Cross your fingers. We're still digging to see if it'll turn into a book or not. So
Awesome. The links to all of Dr. Joseph Farrell's work will be in the description. I can't recommend enough his work and his books. He's written several of them. Very amazing content that he's been putting out, and get his new book as well. For everyone else, thanks for watching and listening. Much love to everyone in the chat. Please be sure to hit the thumbs up button, help the channel and the YouTube algorithm, share, subscribe, hit the bell icon as well. The links to all of my information is in the description. And remember, we're not only in a spiritual war, but a war on humanity. Stay aware, stay alert, keep loving your heart for everyone, stay safe out there. And if you can see through the illusion, you are the solution. See you guys next time.